Today we examine an incredible game where Grandmaster Andor Lilienthal employs a shocking strategy against future world champion Vasily Smyslov. Lilienthal voluntarily creates 4 isolated pawns in his own position, which seems completely anti-positional and violates traditional chess principles. However, he has a hidden idea behind this unconventional play, and this idea leads to a brilliant victory. So let's dive into this unusual game. Lilienthal starts with d4. Smyslov plays the Nimzo Indian defense after c4, e6, knight c3, bishop b4. Lilienthal plays e3, opening the bishop's diagonal, and Smyslov immediately attacks white's pawn center, c5. a3, inviting the exchange on c3, after which white gets the advantage of 2 bishops. On the other hand, his pawn structure on the queen side is damaged. He has an isolated pawn and doubled pawns, and the c4 pawn usually turns into a target of attack. Now that white has doubled pawns on the c-file, it makes little sense, as Lilienthal writes in his annotations, to play d5, because that lets white undouble his pawns after c takes d. So instead of d5, Smyslov develops his knight and he's going to push the d-pawn to d6 instead of d5. Bishop d3 and b6. So the c4 pawn is white's main weakness, so black is going to attack this pawn, usually by playing knight a5 and bishop a6. Now, of course, white can develop the knight on f3, which is perfectly playable, but Lilienthal in our game plays knight e2 instead. From e2, the knight can jump on f4, or after black plays d6, he usually plays e5, and after he plays e5, the pawn will stop controlling the f5 square, and from e2, the knight can be rerouted via g3 to this great f5 square. d6 followed. And now white needs to think about his dark squared bishop, which is restricted by the pawn. So Lilienthal pushes the pawn forward, expanding in the center and opening the bishop's diagonal. And next move, bishop g5 might be quite unpleasant, which would pin the knight. So Smyslov prevents it by playing knight d7. Lilienthal castles and e5. So now we can see the idea behind this pawn structure. The c5 and e5 pawns blockade the e4 and c4 pawns, and of course these pawns, white pawns, which cannot move forward, restrict white's light squared bishop. So the bishop is locked within the pawn, within his pawn structure, white's pawn structure. So the bishop becomes a bad piece. Besides that, black might think about capturing on d4, as the d4 pawn is attacked 3 times. And by playing e5, Smyslov invites white to push the pawn forward, which looks natural. However, Lilienthal didn't do it, because after d5, of course, white still has a slight advantage, but the center would have been closed in this case, and the position would have lost its dynamism. So after knight a5, white would think about the attack on the king side, while black would increase the pressure on the c4 pawn. But it seems that Lilienthal wanted to retain the dynamism, so he, instead of closing the center, he increases the tension in the center by playing f4. And it turns out that although black can capture on d4, which is perfectly playable, black can even win a pawn, white can immediately get the pawn back by retreating the bishop, opening the queen's file, and next move white would capture on d4 with the knight, after which black would remain with a weak d6 pawn, which would fall sooner or later. So instead of capturing on d4, Smyslov develops his queen and reinforces the center. Lilienthal exchanges on e5, opening the f-file for his rook and the bishop's diagonal, and after d takes e, we have reached the important moment where Lilienthal made his shocking move. Now that black doesn't have the pawn on d6 anymore, the pawn has moved to e5, black is ready actually to capture on d4, and get a better position. So white must do something about this threat. And the most natural move, which is also suggested by the computer, would have been d5, of course, crossing the center of the board, grabbing space, and now that black doesn't have the pawn on d6, the d5 pawn would be a protected passed pawn. So white would get a slight advantage on account of this pawn. So after possible knight a5 in this case, white can play knight g3, intending to jump on f5, black can prevent this with g6, and after rook a2, white is going to play rook a2, rerouting the rook to the king side, increasing the pressure on f7, while black in his turn would increase the pressure on c4 with a very complicated game. But instead of d5, Lilienthal makes his shocking move. At the moment, he has only one isolated pawn, but he captures on e5, after which he has 4 isolated pawns in his position, 2 of which are doubled pawns. Besides that, he lets his opponent get a great blockading knight on e5, and white cannot kick this knight away because he doesn't have d or f pawns, so the knight will remain on this great square. Besides that, the e4 pawn, which is isolated pawn, is placed on the half-open e-file, so black major pieces will put pressure on this pawn. So at first sight, Lilienthal's idea doesn't make any sense. But now let's look at this position from Lilienthal's point of view. Why did he capture on e5? Before he did it, black had a pawn on e5, which controlled the f4 square. After the exchange, the black pawn disappeared from e5 and the f4 square has become accessible for the knight, and via f4, white is going to reroute the knight to the great d5 outpost. But still, at first sight it doesn't make much sense just to have one great centralized knight on d5. Is it worth agreeing to a position with 4 isolated pawns? But Lilienthal has another point, besides rerouting the knight on a great d5 square. The pawns, the e4 and a3 pawns, have hidden potential, although at the moment they look miserable. And later in the game this potential will tell, as you will see. So he plays knight f4, and there is nothing black can do to prevent the invasion of the knight. If black tries to do it by playing bishop e6, white would still play knight d5, and after the exchange, white would undouble his pawn, would get protected passed pawns, and his pawn center would be very strong. So instead of bishop e6, Smyslov plays bishop g4, which computer actually likes. It's the first line, but Lilienthal in his annotations dislikes this move, because at the moment white's worst piece is the light squared bishop. It's restricted by its own pawns. But after bishop g4, Lilienthal gets a chance to get rid of this piece. He plays bishop e2, and the bishops are exchanged. But still black's position looks much better. He has only 2 pawn islands, he has ideal pawn structure, and while white has 4 isolated pawns, and black very soon will put pressure on the isolated e-pawn, and he has great knight on e5. Smyslov reinforces his great knight by playing f6 and also vacates the f7 square for the queen in the anticipation of knight d5. The queen retreats to f7. The bishop doesn't have many prospects, so Lilienthal decides to exchange it. And you will see why. He plays bishop f4. After Smyslov castles, so as you see, the c6 knight controls the a5 square, and you will see why this is so important. But after the exchange, the knight must leave the c6 square, and now black doesn't have the knight to control the a5 square. And a4 followed. White is threatening to push the pawn forward, after which either he will capture on b6 himself, and after a takes b, black would have a weakness on b6, or after white plays a5, if black captures, then black's pawn structure on the queen side would be demolished. He would have 3 isolated pawns. So Smyslov prevents it by playing knight c6, taking the a5 square under control. Lilienthal activates his queen, pinning the g-pawn and threatening to capture on f6, because black won't be able to recapture. That's why Smyslov prevents it by playing king h8. And we have reached the critical position. White's position looks completely hopeless. The possible advance of his weak isolated pawns is prevented by the knight. Black doesn't have any weaknesses in his position, and he is ready to play rook e8, preventing the possible advance of the e-pawn once and for all and putting pressure on this weakness, followed by queen e6, increasing the pressure, which would most probably lead to the exchange of the queens, and the arising endgame would be almost hopeless for white. However, Lilienthal has the point. So now you can pause the video and try to find his brilliant idea. So black is ready to play rook e8, preventing e5 once and for all. So white must do something right away. And in order to deflect, of course at the moment white cannot push the e-pawn because the knight controls this square. So in order to deflect the knight from c6, Lilienthal sacrifices the a-pawn. Computer recommends now, as white is threatening to capture on b6, after which black would have weakness, so black must capture on a5, computer recommends b takes a. But from human perspective, of course, that looks terrible, because black would have terrible pawns. So instead, as Smyslov returned his knight to c6 for the only reason to prevent a5, so he captures on a5 with the knight, which looks more natural. But now that the knight is deflected from c6, Lilienthal pushes his second weak pawn forward, creating 2 threats. He takes f, getting back the pawn, and even more serious threat, e6, after which the pawn would turn into a very dangerous passed pawn. So black must do something about this threat. And the best move for black would have been rook e8, returning the pawn, the extra pawn. After possible e takes f, g takes f, rook takes f6, white would have only a slight advantage. But Smyslov didn't want to return the pawn. So instead of rook e8, he, in order to parry both of these threats, he plays f5, attacking the queen. But that was a mistake, because now the e5 pawn turns into a passed pawn. Lilienthal retreats the queen to e2. From e2 the queen will support the advance of the pawn, and white is threatening to push the pawn right away. Black must prevent it, so Smyslov plays rook e8, but Lilienthal renews the threat. So black must blockade the pawn by playing rook e6. Otherwise, let's say if black brings the knight back into play, then e6 would follow, and that would be deadly. For example, after queen g6, e7, again with the tempo, rook f7, queen e6, threatening queen d7, which would target the unguarded rook. Black would be forced to exchange, but after rook takes e6, attacking the knight. Of course, if the knight retreats, white would reinforce his pawn, followed by knight c7, and that would be the end. And if instead of knight a5 black captures, of course his knight would be pinned, and after rook e1 white will win a piece next move. So black must blockade this pawn. He cannot play knight c6, and that's exactly what Smyslov does, rook e6. But rooks are bad blockaders, unlike knights, and now you can see why, because they can easily be attacked. Knight f4, attacking the rook. If the rook retreats, again the pawn would move forward, and that would be deadly. For example, after queen e8, knight d5, attacking the rook. If the rook retreats, the pawn would move forward, attacking the second rook after rook f7, queen e6. Black can try his last chance, knight c6. Now black is ready to capture on e7, but queen takes f7 would follow, and the pawn would promote, and white is winning. So the rook cannot retreat. But Smyslov sacrifices the exchange, because white still has these weaknesses. So he plays rook e8. Knight takes e6, and queen takes e6. Now black is targeting the weak c4 pawn. But Lilienthal plays queen d3, targeting the f5 pawn in his turn. Smyslov defends the pawn. Now he is ready to capture on c4 again. That's why rook f4, defending the pawn. And knight c6, attacking e5. Now the great outpost is occupied by the queen. Lilienthal centralizes his queen. And black, of course, cannot capture, because white would get the second passed pawn, and that would be the end. After possible knight takes e5, the knight would be pinned, and neither knight nor the rook can move, and that would be the end. Of course, black is threatening knight f3 with a fork and the discovered attack on the white rook, but white can simply play king f1, parrying this threat, and black pieces cannot move. He can only move his king, and after rook f2, king f6, rook e2, there is nothing black can do. So he can only move his pawns, but after d6, for example, a4, white can return the exchange, and after the exchange of the rooks, the pawn would promote. So after queen d5, as queen takes d5 doesn't work, Smyslov captures on e5, finally eliminating this annoying pawn and creating a threat, knight f3, check with the discovered attack on the rook. But Lilienthal makes a simple move, king f1, preventing this check, and also the king is defending the rook, and you will see that it's important a little bit later. So the knight is pinned now, it cannot move. Neither can the major pieces leave the e-file, because the knight would fall. So Smyslov brings his king closer, king g7. But now, after rook f2, king f6 and rook e2, the pin becomes deadly, and there is nothing black can do. If he captures on d5, still after c takes d, the same variation would arise. After d6, white is winning. So, as there is nothing else he can do, he pushes the h-pawn forward. But now, rook takes e5. Black cannot capture the queen, because white would capture with the rook, and now you can see why it's important that the rook is defended by the king. Black cannot. If black captures, white simply is upper rook, and white is upper rook anyways. So queen takes d5 doesn't work. So if the queen retreats, white would simply capture the rook, so Smyslov must give up his queen. After queen takes e5, rook takes e5, rook takes e5, queen d6, Lilienthal gets a position with the queen against the rook, and Smyslov continued the resistance for a few more moves, but in this position he finally resigned. And now I recommend watching Lilienthal's most famous game, where he sacrificed his queen to none other than Jose Raul Capablanca. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.